Hi, I'm Lynn Blend. I'm a drag queen, a Vtuber, and a true crime enthusiast, and today I'll be looking into the case of Jack the Ripper, which is one of the most famous unsolved serial killer cases of all time. In this first of two parts, I'll be setting the scene of where these murders took place and giving a background on each of the women who were murdered. London in the late 1800s was one of the wealthiest and most glamorous places on earth, but it also had its dark side. In the East End, there was an area known as the Whitechapel district. This area was home to some of London's most vulnerable citizens and was known for being associated with poverty, crime, and prostitution. Over 100 years later, this area is most famously known as the home of one of history's biggest unsolved mysteries, the serial killer known only as Jack the Ripper. Now, before we get into this story, please be aware that this video will contain discussions of the Ripper's violence against women, corpse mutilation, implied sexual assault, as well as discussions of domestic violence in the backgrounds of some of the women, so please use your discretion and prioritize your own mental health, first and foremost. Seeing as how the Whitechapel district was known for being a rough area, there were a lot of murders and attacks during the time period that the Ripper was active, so it's not entirely certain which of these can be attributed to him, but the number we see most often is 5 because of the similarities in both the victims and in the way that they were killed. So these 5 women are known as the Canonical 5, and they were all murdered in a very similar way within the area of the Whitechapel district during August through November of 1888. The first of these women was Mary Nichols. Mary was born on August 26, 1845 in London to her parents Edward and Caroline Walker. She was their middle child. In 1863, she met a printer named William Nichols, and the two of them were married on January 16, 1864. There's a plaque up in the church where they were married to commemorate her. It has the inscription, "Remember her life, not its end," and personally I think that's really sweet. Mary and her husband would go on to have 5 children together between the years of 1866 to 1879, and the whole family lived together with her father Edward until 1875, when they would move into their own apartment in South London. Now, unfortunately from here, things start to go downhill for Mary. Within the next 5 years, her mental health would start to decline. She became an alcoholic. Her husband, William, was having an affair with the nurse who was supposed to be caring for Mary after her last pregnancy. So, in September of 1880, Mary and her husband separated, and she moved out of their apartment. The children stayed behind with her husband. William was initially paying her alimony, but sued her to get out of paying because he claimed that she was leading quote-unquote an immoral life. The court ruled in his favor, and Mary lost her only source of income. At this point, Mary bounced around a lot between living with men she was in relationships with, living with her father, stints of homelessness, and living at various workhouses. And by 1888, she was moving around between common lodging houses in the East End of London. This sets the scene for Mary's final day, August 30th, 1888. She was trying to get into a common lodging house to spend the night, but she'd been drinking and didn't have the money to rent a bed, and she got turned away. From her interaction with the keeper of the house, he assumed that she intended to go raise the money to pay for a bed with prostitution. She was last seen alive at 2:30 a.m. on the 31st by her friend and a fellow resident at the common lodging house, Emily Holland. And according to Emily's account, Mary had made the money she needed, but she had used it to drink more, and she was staggering drunk at this point. Emily asked her to come to the common house with her, and she offered to pay for her bed, but Mary refused, insisting on going out to make more money and pay for her own bed. Just 1 hour later, at 3:30 a.m., her body would be found in an area called Buck's Row, She was lying on her back on the side of the road with her skirt raised up over her waist. She'd been dead for about half an hour. Her throat was cut so deeply that her head was almost cut off. Upon further examination, police also found that she had also been disemboweled. We see a very similar story with the Ripper's second victim, Annie Chapman. Annie was born in September of 1841 in Paddington, London. She was married to John Chapman on May 1st, 1869. The two of them moved to West London and had 3 children together between the years of 1870 and 1880. But sadly, in 1882, her story once again takes a darker turn. Annie and her husband's oldest child had died of meningitis, and both of them became alcoholics while coping with this loss. This would ultimately lead to the end of their marriage a few years later. John would continue to send her an allowance to help her support herself in the years after that, but then on Christmas of 1886, he died of liver cirrhosis, and after that, Annie would make her money by selling crocheted items or prostitution. Annie would spend the last couple years of her life as an almost permanent resident of Crossingham's lodging house in Spitalfields, where she got along well with most of the tenants and the keeper of the house, but things took a bit of a turn for her. In the beginning of September of 1888, she got into a huge fist fight with another woman living at the house, and for the week after that, she had a black eye, bruising on her chest, and just generally was not feeling well. On Annie's last day, September 7th, 1888, her friend Amelia Palmer ran into her on the street around 5 p.m. Annie told Amelia that she was feeling too ill to do anything, but that she had to get some money together so that she could pay for her bed that night. Later that night, at 11:30 p.m., she made her way to Crossingham's to sit in the kitchen for a couple hours. But at 1:35 a.m. on the 8th, the keeper of the house told her that she couldn't stay any longer because she didn't have money for her bed, and she left, asking him to save a bed for her because she wouldn't be gone long. September 8th, 1888 at 5:30 a.m. would be the last time that she would be seen alive. A woman named Elizabeth Long was walking down Hanbury Street when she saw Annie talking to a man. Now, considering that Annie would be found dead in this exact same spot only a half hour after that, Elizabeth Long could have definitely witnessed Annie talking to Jack the Ripper moments before her murder. At 6 a.m., she was found dead lying right next to the stairs that Elizabeth Long had last seen her. Just like with Mary Nichols, her skirt had been pulled up over her waist, her throat was cut deeply, but this time the Ripper had extracted her womb and taken it with him. The next woman who would unfortunately have a run-in with the Ripper was Elizabeth Stride. She was born in Sweden on November 27th, 1843, and throughout her early adulthood in the 1860s, she would bounce back and forth from being a live-in servant and being a sex worker. In February of 1866, she immigrated to London, and then 3 years later, she got married to John Stride, and they settled down in East London to open up a coffee shop together. Over the next few years, Elizabeth's husband would develop chronic illness, and Elizabeth would try to get financial assistance from the Swedish church to help support them in 1879. A few years after that, in 1881, Elizabeth and her husband ended up separating, and then shortly after, in 1844, he died of heart disease. In the years following her husband's death, Elizabeth would move back and forth between living in common lodging houses and living with a man that she was seeing named Michael Kidney. He was being abusive to her, unfortunately, and she was unable to successfully press charges against him. She struggled with chronic bronchitis and alcoholism during this time, and supported herself with prostitution and cleaning rooms in the common lodging house. She would finally break away from her abuser in September of 1888 but she unfortunately didn't get to have this freedom for very long. On her last day, September 29th, 1888, she spent the day cleaning at the common lodging house, and then she went to the pub. By 7, she returned to the common lodging house, and then left again. From 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. on the 30th, there are actually a lot of sightings of her. And, frustratingly, there are also opportunities that someone could have stepped in to stop what was about to happen to her. Several people would see Elizabeth with a man in the area of Burner Street from the hours of 11 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. It's not known who this man was, or if it was the same man in all of these sightings, but at 12:45 a.m., a man named Israel Schwartz had the last sighting of her, and he would actually see what was likely the beginning of her murder. He saw a man attacking her and throwing her to the ground, but he decided that it was probably a situation of domestic violence, and he crossed the street, so he didn't have to get involved. The Ripper may have known that he had witnesses, because it seems like he didn't get to finish whatever he was planning on doing to Elizabeth. She was found only 15 minutes later after this last sighting. Her throat was slit, her body was still warm. Sadly, it's most likely because of this interruption that the Ripper wasn't done for the night. Catherine Eddows was born in Wolverhampton on April 4th, 1842, and her family would move to London when she was little. Her parents both died when she was a teenager, and she was separated from her siblings and sent back to Wolverhampton to live with her aunt. Her first marriage was to a sailor named Thomas Conway. Now, there doesn't seem to be any record of this marriage, but she had a tattoo on her arm of his initials. Catherine and Thomas had 3 children together, and they supported their family by selling books as street vendors. The family moved to London, and their relationship was rocky due to Catherine's alcoholism and her temper, and her husband's physical abuse. Catherine and her husband would frequently break up, get back together, but they would separate for good in 1880, and Catherine would move into a common lodging house in London. It's there that she would meet a man named John Kelly, and the two of them would be in a relationship and live in the common lodging house together for the rest of her life. Catherine and John worked a series of odd jobs to make enough money to pay for their beds at the common lodging house. This leads us to September 29th, 1888. Catherine and John went to a pawn shop in the morning to sell John's boots to pay for their breakfast. At 2 p.m., Catherine told John that she was going to try to borrow some money from her daughter, and then she left, and this is the last time that John would see Catherine. It's not on record what she did for the rest of that afternoon, but somewhere along the way, her plans must have changed, because by 8:30 that night, she was found drunk in the street. Police were called, and they arrested Catherine for public drunkenness. They put her in a cell at the Bishopsgate police station, and she was left there to sleep until around midnight on the 30th. Now, just as the Ripper was leaving the scene of Elizabeth Stride's murder at 1 a.m., Catherine was being released from her cell. She headed towards Mitre Square, where the Ripper was also approaching from the opposite direction. At 1:30 a.m., a man named Joseph Lawand was the last person to see her alive, and he saw her with a man. This man was most likely the Ripper. Only 15 minutes later, the police, who were still around the scene of Elizabeth Stride's murder, not far away, came across Catherine's body in Mitre Square. Like the previous victims, her throat was cut deeply, she was disemboweled, but it seems like the Ripper was deeply frustrated by being interrupted during the murder of Elizabeth Stride, and he took it out on Catherine in a very personal way. He heavily mutilated her face, cutting into her cheeks and her eyelids. He also took her womb and her left kidney with him. The last of these canonical 5 Ripper victims is Mary Kelly. For Mary, there aren't many records of what her life was like, so the only sources of information that we have for her background comes from what she told people she met when she moved into a common lodging house in Spitalfields in 1887. Mary was born in 1863 in Limerick, Ireland, and lived in Wales as a child. By 1879, she was married to a man named Davies, but only a few years later, her husband was killed in an explosion. So Mary went to live with her cousin in Cardiff, where she became a sex worker. She moved to London in 1884 to work in a brothel there, and by April of 1887, she had moved around to the common lodging house in Spitalfields. Her last day on November 8th, 1888, was spent with several different friends who she saw throughout that day. Later that night at 11:45, her neighbor, Mary Ann Cox, saw her coming home drunk with a strange man. Her neighbors heard her singing in her room from about midnight to 1 a.m. on the 9th, when she apparently went out again. A man named George Hutchinson was the last person to see her alive. At 2 a.m., Mary approached him on the street to ask for money. He kept on walking, but then later he noticed Mary talking with a man. An interesting detail of the case of Mary Kelly specifically is that she was the only Ripper victim whose body was not found in the street. At around 4 a.m., Mary's neighbors heard a faint voice from her room yelling, "Murder!" But did nothing to intervene. Her body would not be discovered until 10:45 that morning, when her landlord sent his assistant to collect her rent. He found Mary's body on her bed, and the scene he witnessed was the Ripper's most horrifying corpse mutilation yet. I am going to try not to get too graphic, but just a warning, this part is really gruesome. Mary's body was found naked and skinned, and her skin was lying in a pile on the bedside table. Her neck was cut on all sides down to the bone. All of the organs in her abdominal cavity were removed and placed around the body, and her face was heavily mutilated. Mary Kelly is the youngest of the Ripper's victims, and she was only 25 years old at the time of her death. I hope now that we're at this point in the video that it's clear why I wanted to give so much background on these women. I feel like in this case, in so many cases, especially those where the victims are sex workers, a lot of the coverage that you see is anywhere from dismissive to dehumanizing to the victims. I just wanted there to be at least one space to remember that these 5 women were people. They had a hard lot in life, and they did absolutely nothing to bring this on themselves. I wanted one space where we could talk about who they were when they were alive and see pictures of them while they were alive. This concludes the first part of our discussion of Jack the Ripper. Coming up next, I'll be posting the finale of my playthrough of Famicom Detective Club, The Missing Heir, as well as the second video in this Jack the Ripper series, where I'll be going over motives, theories, and possible suspects. If you want to support these videos and help me make more, you can visit my Ko-Fi at ko-fi.com/spinnblend. Thanks so much for watching.